People no longer bound by an NDA. What secret can you expose? Story 1. About 20 years ago, I signed an NDA with a major record label because I was involved in their attempts to move into online music sales and streaming. It was a minefield. They were terrified of upsetting high street retailers since those sales determined chart rankings at the time. Their digital efforts were constantly blocked by corporate higher-ups who didn't understand the technology. One week, all the top-level executives flew to Buenos Aires for an MP3 conference to get up to speed. Instead of learning much, they spent most of their time partying. The only thing that really stuck with them was a scare tactic presentation about how teens could rip MP3s off the web and redistribute them. When they came back, they panicked and ordered every single track in the catalog to be scrubbed from the internet. Number 30-second previews, no snippets, nothing. They wanted the entire catalog essentially buried, thinking it would force people to buy CDs again. The funniest part? They let visitors take home CDs from shelves in the office. I'd grab a bunch and rip them myself. It was peak early 2000s piracy. Their paranoia and refusal to adapt to digital music pretty much defined that era. Story 2. I once got a concussion at work. It was a serious injury, and although I was 99% sure I hit my head, I lost all memory of the accident itself. Since it was caught on camera, I asked to see the footage to confirm what had happened. Management flat out refused. They claimed there was no evidence I hit my head and denied my request to view the tape. I even offered to sign away my right to sue. I just wanted to know the truth. Their denial made me suspicious, so I ended up suing them. I won the case, which covered my lost wages and medical bills, even though I hadn't initially asked for either. Finally, I got to view the footage. It was undeniable. A loud bonk, me falling down, and a dent left in the bulkhead where my head hit. Afterward, office staff admitted that upper management had ordered them to lie and say nothing was on the tape. They said this was standard procedure for dealing with injured employees. Deny, lie, and let it play out in court. I quit shortly after. It was clear they cared more about avoiding lawsuits than about the safety of their employees. Story 3. I used to work at a startup that claimed to care about employee happiness. They rolled out a system to track how satisfied employees were, supposedly to make things better for us. At first, it sounded promising, but it didn't take long to figure out what was really going on. Instead of using the data to improve workplace morale, they used it to identify unhappy employees and fire them before they quit. This way, they avoided costs like unemployment claims or the payouts that come when employees leave on their own terms. It was all about protecting their bottom line, not helping us. They had this whole strategy of letting people go rather than waiting for them to quit. It felt manipulative and cold. Instead of addressing the issues that made employees unhappy, they just preemptively cut people loose. Morale only got worse after that because everyone knew what the system was really for. It was disheartening to see how they could take something that sounded so positive, employee happiness tracking, and twist it into a tool for corporate efficiency at the expense of their workers. I didn't stick around long after realizing what they were doing. Story 4. At one job I had, the company introduced a suggestion inbox where employees could share ideas to improve the workplace. It seemed like a great idea, and people really got behind it. Everyone was eager to contribute, thinking their input might actually lead to changes. The problem? Nobody was monitoring it. It was purely for show. People would submit thoughtful suggestions, and they'd just disappear into the void. Management never checked the inbox, let alone implemented any of the ideas. But because the concept was well received, most employees assumed it was being taken seriously. It was a classic placebo effect. People felt good just knowing the suggestion box existed, even though nothing ever came of it. The illusion of being heard was enough to keep morale up for a while. I remember laughing about it with a coworker when we found out the truth. It was so ridiculous. Why go through the trouble of setting up a system if you're not going to use it? It became one of those inside jokes in the office, but it also left a bad taste in my mouth. It was just another example of management pretending to care without actually doing anything. Story 5. At a company I worked for, on-time delivery was a huge issue. For years, we struggled to meet deadlines with delivery rates as low as 40%. Then a new manager came in, and suddenly our on-time delivery rate shot up to an impressive 95%. Everyone was amazed until we found out how he did it. The manager hadn't actually improved anything. Instead, he redefined what on-time meant. Whenever a delivery was going to be late, he'd have the team notify the customer of the delay and ask if they still wanted the product. If the customer agreed, the new delivery date became the official date. That way, the delivery was recorded as on time, even though it wasn't. Our company started bragging about our 95% on-time rate in marketing materials, claiming we were one of the best in the industry. In reality, we were still meeting less than 30% of our original deadlines. It was all smoke and mirrors. The whole thing felt dishonest, but it worked for a while. It made me wonder how many other companies use similar tactics to manipulate statistics and create a false sense of reliability. Story 6. Years ago, I heard a story about an airport that was getting constant complaints about how long it took for checked baggage to arrive at the pickup point. Instead of speeding up the baggage handling process, they came up with a simpler solution: make people walk farther. They increased the distance between the gates and the baggage claim area so passengers would spend more time walking and less time waiting. The actual time it took for the bags to arrive didn't change, but because people weren't standing around as long, the complaints stopped. It was such a simple, clever solution, but it also felt a little sneaky. They didn't solve the underlying problem, they just changed people's perception of it. I've thought about that story a lot over the years. It's a good example of how perception can be managed without actually improving the service itself. Sometimes, it's not about fixing the problem but about making it feel less like a problem to the people experiencing it. Story 7. I once worked at a private school that marketed itself as being for gifted students. The owner administered the giftedness test herself, and I quickly realized it was a sham. The only real criterion was whether the family could afford the tuition. If you could pay, you were gifted. If your sibling could pay, they were gifted too. It didn't matter if you lived across town or had no academic credentials. Everyone who could write a check passed the test. It was frustrating to see how the school exploited parents' desire to provide the best education for their kids. The marketing made it seem like an exclusive institution for exceptional students, but in reality, it was all about money. I stayed long enough to see how the illusion was maintained. The school spent more on appearances than on actual educational resources. They wanted parents to feel like they were getting something special, even though the quality of the education didn't match the price tag. It was disheartening to work in a place where profit mattered more than integrity. I eventually left, but the experience left a bad taste in my mouth about how private education can operate. Story 8. I've worked with 2 people who went to Harvard, and honestly, they were some of the weakest performers I've ever encountered. Both struggled with basic tasks and problem solving, which seemed odd given the reputation of their alma mater. It didn't take long to notice they had one major thing in common. Both came from very wealthy families. In one case, I found out that their family had donated millions to the university. In fact, a facility at Harvard was named after their dad. It was clear that money had played a significant role in their admission. It made me question everything I thought I knew about Ivy League schools. For years, I assumed that getting into Harvard was all about intelligence and hard work. But after working with these individuals, I realized that wealth and connections play just as big a role, if not bigger. It's disheartening to think about how many talented students might be overlooked because they don't have the financial resources to make themselves valuable to the school. This experience completely changed my view of elite universities. They're not just about merit. They're also about privilege, and that realization was hard to swallow. Story 9. When I was 16, I worked for a cancer charity, and it opened my eyes to how some nonprofits really operate. Half the people working there would order items for themselves and charge it to the charity. It was shocking to see how casually this was done. At first, I thought it was just 1 or 2 bad apples, but it seemed like everyone was in on it. These were people who were supposed to be dedicating their time and energy to helping others, but instead, they were treating the charity like their personal piggy bank. That experience made me deeply skeptical of charities in general. I've stopped donating to most of them because I can't shake the feeling that my money isn't going where it's supposed to. I've read about other scandals, like the Red Cross raising $500 million for Haiti and only building 6 homes, and it just reinforces my doubts. I know there are good charities out there, but it feels like a minefield trying to figure out which ones are trustworthy. It shouldn't be this hard to do the right thing. My time at the cancer charity was a harsh lesson in how easily good intentions can be corrupted. Story 10. I worked for a real estate company that had a huge problem with black mold in its properties, but they refused to address it. The official policy was to not look into it. Management didn't want to know how dangerous the mold was because then they'd be legally required to fix it. The only department allowed to discuss the issue was PR, and their job was to bury it. Everyone else was told to keep quiet. It wasn't just neglect, it was intentional. They knowingly put tenants at risk to save money. One case stands out in my mind. A tenant complained about severe respiratory issues and asked if there was mold in their apartment. Management told them there wasn't, even though we all knew there was. Felt so wrong, but speaking up would have cost me my job. I eventually left the company, but the experience still haunts me. It's hard to believe that a company could be so callous about people's health. Years later, I heard about a tenant who got the city involved. The company panicked, refunded their rent, and canceled their lease. It was proof that they knew what they were doing was wrong. Story 11. I worked in tech support for a company that prided itself on having the fastest call times in the industry. Our manager was constantly praised because his team's average call times were under 10 minutes, compared to the company average of 12 to 17 minutes. He even received awards and bonuses for his efficiency. But the truth was, his strategy was simple: hang up on customers. He instructed us to end calls as quickly as possible, often without confirming if the issue was resolved. His favorite phrase was, "Tell them to reboot and call back if it doesn't work." It was frustrating because we knew this approach didn't actually help anyone. Customers would call back angry, and their problems often still weren't fixed. But as long as the call times stayed low, management didn't care. Eventually, the company introduced new metrics to track first call resolution, and the entire strategy fell apart. Customer satisfaction plummeted, and the company went out of business within a couple of years. Looking back, it's no surprise things ended the way they did. You can't build a successful business on empty statistics and bad customer service. It was a classic case of short-term thinking leading to long-term failure. Story 12. I once sat in on a high-level Herbalife meeting, and what I heard was horrifying. The top sellers openly discussed how to manipulate low-income and less educated people into joining the scheme. They called these individuals their best targets, because they were desperate enough to believe in the dream Herbalife was selling. Single mothers were a particular focus. They were encouraged to join with promises of working from home and earning extra income to support their families. It was all a lie, of course. The real money came from recruiting others into the pyramid, not from selling products. The meeting felt like a masterclass in exploitation. They talked about how to use emotional appeals and false hope to hook people in. It made me sick to my stomach. After that, I couldn't look at the company the same way. I left shortly after because I didn't want to be part of something so predatory. To this day, I warn people to stay away from MLMs. They're not just scams, they're built on taking advantage of people who can't afford to lose. Herbalife may call itself a business opportunity, but what I saw was nothing more than a sophisticated con. Story 13. Back in 2014, I was struggling to hit my yearly budget at work. I didn't know it at the time, but I was on the chopping block. Then, a coworker named Pam stepped in and helped me reallocate my clients' ad schedules. Thanks to her, I was able to invoice just enough to meet my target for the year. 2 weeks later, I was let go. But because I had met my budget, they couldn't fire me for underperformance. Instead, I got a severance package of $155,000. Looking back, I'm convinced Pam knew what was coming and decided to help me out. It wasn't the first time I'd heard of something like this happening. My dad had a similar experience in 2005. An HR rep helped him maximize his severance and benefits before he was let go. I'll always be grateful to Pam. She didn't have to help me, but she did, and it made all the difference. It's rare to find people like her in the workplace. People who look out for others even when there's nothing in it for them. If you're reading this, Pam, thank you. I owe you more than I can ever repay. Story 14. I used to work at a university in South Florida on an academic integrity team. It was our job to review cases of cheating and plagiarism and decide whether the accusations were valid. We had to sign NDAs when we joined the team, which I thought was standard. What I didn't expect was the blatant cover-ups. On 3 separate occasions, employees who were taking classes were caught cheating. The evidence was undeniable, but every time we were told to let it go. The reasoning? It would look bad for the university if the cases became public. It was disgusting. The integrity team was supposed to uphold academic standards, but we were being told to ignore them for PR reasons. I tried to push back, but it didn't make a difference. The message was clear. Protecting the university's reputation mattered more than doing the right thing. I couldn't take it anymore and eventually quit. It's been years, but the experience still bothers me. I can't help but wonder how many other universities operate the same way. Education is supposed to be about honesty and learning, but in my experience, it's just as corrupt as any other industry. Story 15. I worked at a hospital specializing in cancer care, and they were doing something groundbreaking, targeting specific types of cancer with the right chemo. It sounded promising, but there was a catch. Most patients had to go through unnecessary rounds of chemo for other cancers first because it made the hospital more money. The insurance companies and government regulations allowed this, so the hospital exploited it. Instead of getting one targeted treatment, patients with cancer C would endure multiple rounds of chemo for cancers A and B first. It was devastating for the patients, both physically and emotionally. I remember one patient who was optimistic at the start but became a shell of himself after months of unnecessary treatment. It was heartbreaking to watch. I tried to speak up about it, but the higher-ups wouldn't listen. They only cared about the revenue, not the patients. I eventually left, but the experience stayed with me. If you or a loved one ever face cancer, make sure to question the treatment plan. Ask if it's targeted for your specific cancer or if it's just padding someone's bottom line. Could save you months of unnecessary suffering. Story 16. Back in 2013, I worked for a private company partnered with an East Asian government. Our project involved setting up free health clinics in several African nations. On the surface, it seemed like a noble effort, offering high-quality healthcare to people who needed it most. But I quickly learned the horrifying truth. The clinics were secretly sterilizing people without their knowledge. The methods were non-surgical, and our company was given quotas of 30,000 to 50,000 sterilizations per year. The government funding the project wanted to control population growth in the area, and we were the ones carrying out their agenda. The locals trusted us because we provided better healthcare than they'd ever received before. They had no idea what was really happening. I was sworn to secrecy when I joined the project, and the NDA didn't explicitly mention sterilization, just the methods we used. I stayed with the company until 2017, but the guilt never left me. I don't know if the program is still running, but I can't forget what I saw. It was a moral crime, plain and simple. People deserve to know what was done to them, but I also know the risks of speaking out. Some secrets are too dangerous to expose. Story 17. I used to work night shifts at a hotel, and something strange would happen every night between 1 a.m. and 6 a.m. The internet would go out. At first, I thought it was just a system glitch, but I later learned it was deliberate. The hotel turned off the internet to save money, not realizing or not caring about the consequences. Without internet, the security cameras stopped recording, and the fire alarm system didn't work properly. If a fire started during those hours, the alarms would go off, but no emergency calls would be made. Unless someone driving by noticed and called it in, we'd have no way of getting help. One night, there was an assault in the parking lot. The police asked for security footage, but we didn't have any because the cameras hadn't been recording. It was embarrassing to explain that to the detectives, but management didn't seem to care. The whole situation felt like an insane risk to take to save a little money. Fires don't wait for the internet to come back on, and neither do emergencies. I left the job not long after. It wasn't worth the stress of working for a company that prioritized cost-cutting over safety. Story 18. In 1999, I worked for a website creation company managing a contest for a major bank. The prize was a round-trip paid ticket to the Super Bowl, and I was responsible for setting up the rules and the random selection tool for picking a winner. Everything was supposed to be fair and above board, or so I thought. When the contest ended, I was told to forget about the random selection tool. Instead, I was instructed to go into the database and find someone who lived in South Florida, where the Super Bowl was being held that year. The bank didn't want to pay for airfare, so they rigged the contest to choose a local winner. I was shocked but knew better than to argue. The legal department had written the rules, and as far as they were concerned, this was just business as usual. It wasn't until years later that I realized how common this kind of thing probably is. Anytime you see a contest that seems too good to be true, chances are it's not as random as it claims to be. It was an eye-opening experience, but it also made me cynical about corporate honesty. Story 19. When I worked for a transit system, I learned about a bizarre policy for bus drivers involved in accidents. The official rule was simple. Drivers were not to speak to anyone until a supervisor arrived on the scene. But the preferred method for avoiding trouble? Pretend to be injured. The company actually trained drivers to fake injuries after accidents, knowing it would delay investigations and prevent them from accidentally admitting fault. They even budgeted for the fines associated with wasting emergency resources because it was cheaper than dealing with lawsuits or paying settlements. I remember one incident where a minor fender bender turned into a full-blown emergency scene because the driver followed this protocol. The whole thing felt absurd, but it was standard procedure. The company also had an entire team dedicated to auditing accident claims because so many people falsely claimed to have been on buses during incidents. It was a stressful environment, and the constant focus on avoiding liability made it clear that safety wasn't the priority. Eventually, I left. The culture of deception and the willingness to waste emergency resources made it impossible for me to stay. It's one thing to protect your employees, but this just felt wrong. Story 20. I once worked on pitch packets for Hasbro, and some of their movie ideas were wild. One of the most memorable was a gritty reboot of Stretch Armstrong. Starring Taylor Lautner, the wolf from Twilight. They wanted it to have the same dark, serious tone as Nolan's Batman trilogy. Another idea was even more bizarre. A Candyland movie for kids, but with a Lord of the Rings-style epic storyline. They envisioned Adam Sandler as the lead, which just added to the absurdity. Both projects made it pretty far in development with detailed pitch packets and early concepts. But in the end, they were shelved. The Stretch Armstrong project was scrapped entirely, but the Candyland idea still floats around in some form. It was fascinating to see how much time and effort went into these pitches, even though they never made it to production. It also made me realize just how many ideas never see the light of day in the entertainment industry. Story 21. I worked in tech support for a hardware company that sold a bad batch of chips. These chips caused random crashes and resets, which affected a lot of customers. The company knew about the issue and even got a settlement from the supplier, but they decided it was too expensive to fix the units already in the field. Instead, they fixed the issue for future products and left the rest of us in support to deal with the fallout. We were given strict talking points to follow when customers called in, and we were told to act like we'd never seen the issue before. It was frustrating because we knew exactly what the problem was, but we weren't allowed to admit it. Some customers had to replace their units multiple times, and we still had to pretend it was an isolated case. The whole situation felt dishonest, but management didn't care. As long as the issue didn't hit the company's bottom line, they were fine with letting customers suffer. Story 22. I worked for a company that marketed its products as handmade and artisanal, but the reality was very different. Most of the items were mass-produced in overseas factories. The company relied on clever wording and imagery to sell the idea of small-batch craftsmanship, but behind the scenes, it was all about efficiency and profit. One product that stands out was a line of handcrafted candles. The marketing materials showed artisans pouring wax into molds by hand, but in reality, the candles were made on assembly lines in a factory. The only human involvement was packing them into boxes. It felt deceptive, but technically, the company wasn't lying. They used vague language to avoid making outright false claims. Still, it didn't sit right with me. Customers were paying a premium for something they thought was unique and handmade, but they were really just getting mass-produced goods with a fancy label. Story 23. I used to work for a contractor that handled cybersecurity for one of the US power grids. My job was to help secure the grid against cyber attacks and assist in writing regulations to enforce those protections. But the deeper I got into the job, the more I realized how little was actually being done. Every Monday, we'd go over a list of non-compliant systems, essentially major vulnerabilities. The lawyers would always step in and argue that those systems were technically compliant, even though they clearly weren't secure. I'd remind them that I was part of the committee that wrote the regulations, but they didn't care. Instead of fixing the issues, they'd document justifications for why they didn't need to. It became clear that the grid was being held together by outdated technology, minimal backups, and duct tape. Some systems were so old that no one knew how they worked, and no one dared to touch them. The stress of knowing how vulnerable the system was became too much for me. I eventually quit, but I can't stop thinking about how disastrous a major attack could be. Millions of people could be affected, and there's no doubt lives would be lost. Story 24. I once worked with a school board that claimed to address bullying proactively, but one meeting revealed the truth. A group of parents and board members gathered to discuss ongoing bullying issues. One concerned parent brought up how the bullying was affecting their child, hoping for a plan to address it. What happened next shocked me. One board member dismissed the issue entirely, saying, "Just leave it. Let the weak ones fall out." That was the end of the discussion. No action plan was created, and the meeting moved on as if nothing had been said. I couldn't believe how cruel and dismissive the comment was. It made me wonder how many other schools take the same approach, ignoring bullying instead of addressing it. The idea that children should be left to fall out if they can't handle bullying was heartbreaking. I wasn't allowed to speak publicly about the meeting because I'd signed an NDA, but the experience left a bad taste in my mouth. Schools are supposed to protect and nurture students, not let them suffer because it's easier. I left the job not long after. I couldn't work for an organization that valued convenience over the well-being of its students. Story 25. I've worked in IT for years, and one thing has always stood out. The most critical systems in banking, insurance, and finance are often running on outdated technology. These systems are held together by a mix of obsolete programming languages, duct tape, and prayers. One time, I worked on a system that still used backup tapes from the 1990s. The tape robot was broken, so the cleaning tape had been sitting in the bay for over 20 years. No one dared to touch it because they were afraid the whole system would collapse. The problem is that these systems are so old that no one knows how they work anymore. The people who originally built them are either retired or dead, and there's no documentation to explain how to fix them. Even worse, companies refuse to spend the money to replace or analyze these systems. One janitor unplugging the wrong cord could bring an entire financial institution to its knees. It's terrifying to think about how fragile these systems are, but no one wants to invest in fixing them. It's only a matter of time before one of these outdated systems fails catastrophically, and when it does, the consequences will be enormous. Story 26. I worked for a manufacturing company that produced electrical components for Tesla, Rivian, and Ford. One day, we got word that Elon Musk was furious because Tesla components were being made in the same facility as Rivian's. He threatened to pull the contract unless changes were made. The solution: management built a wall between the production lines and told Elon that the Rivian contract had been canceled. In reality, nothing changed. We continued producing parts for both companies and Ford on opposite sides of the wall. The whole situation felt ridiculous. There aren't many manufacturers capable of producing high-quality power electronics, so sharing facilities is pretty common. But Elon's hatred for Rivian made him demand a separation, even if it was just for show. It was surreal to see how much effort went into keeping him happy, even though the reality didn't change. The wall was more of a psychological barrier than anything else. Story 27. When I worked as a chemical engineer, I uncovered 3 major environmental disasters that no one knows about. These were Superfund-level toxic spills, but because they happened on private property, the companies involved have managed to keep them hidden. One site was on a major river that supplies drinking water to several cities downstream. Another was near a large lake, and I noticed that surrounding communities had unusually high rates of liver and testicular cancer. I'm not a statistician, but the connection seemed obvious to me. The companies responsible fenced off the contaminated areas and kept the land unused. As long as they don't sell the property, no one has to test the soil. It's a loophole that lets them avoid accountability. I wanted to blow the whistle, but I know what happens to people who speak out. These companies have resources and connections, and I didn't want to risk my safety. Story 28. My wife used to be involved in a well-known multi-level marketing (MLM) company. During her true believer phase, she dragged me to one of their motivational seminars. It was supposed to teach attendees how to succeed in the business, but what I saw was shocking. At one point, the speaker openly advised the audience to commit tax fraud. They encouraged people to write off everything as a business expense, even if it wasn't remotely legitimate. Some examples were borderline, but most of it was outright illegal. The speaker framed this as a way to invest more back into your business, which was MLM speak for pumping more money into the pyramid. My wife thought it was brilliant advice, but I knew it was a recipe for disaster. We argued about it for weeks until she finally agreed to ask our tax advisor. His response: "That's fraud. I hope you like the color orange." Story 29. In the early 2000s, I worked at Walmart in the clothing department. One night, I was handed a memo with a strange instruction. I was to secretly remove all the tags from certain products that said, "Made in Myanmar." At first, I didn't understand why. Then I learned that the brand involved wanted to distance itself from Myanmar due to political controversies. Instead of addressing the issue ethically, they decided to hide the origin of their products. I spent hours cutting out the tags and replacing them with plain ones. It felt dishonest, but I didn't have much of a choice. I was just an employee following orders. Story 30. I once worked for a packaging company that handled American flags. These flags were manufactured in China, and the outer packaging was required by law to say, "Made in China." Our job was to remove the outer plastic and repackage the flags so customers wouldn't see the origin label. The company wanted buyers to believe the flags were made in the USA. It was a tedious process. We had to unwrap each flag, discard the packaging, and rewrap it in plain plastic. The amount of waste we created was ridiculous. Management even told us to stop balling up the plastic because it made the trash bags too heavy to pull out at the end of the day. Story 31. I worked for a major airplane manufacturer, and while most of our employees were skilled, there was a growing trend of hiring unqualified workers. These hires weren't based on merit. They were the result of nepotism and rushed recruitment to meet production deadlines. One day, I trained a new employee whose job was to install wiring harnesses in the cockpit. Within an hour, it was clear he had no idea what he was doing. He didn't know how to read a wiring diagram, which is a basic skill for the job. I asked him about his background, and he admitted he had no prior experience in aviation or electronics. The situation became dangerous when he incorrectly installed a harness, creating a short circuit. Luckily, we caught it during quality control, but it could have caused a catastrophic failure if it had gone unnoticed. Management's response? They shrugged it off, saying, "We're short-staffed." It was clear they prioritized speed over safety. Story 32. Years ago, I worked for Columbia Sportswear. The company had a great public image, but behind the scenes, things weren't so rosy. The owner, Gert Boyle, was known for her tough persona, but I heard unsettling stories about how she treated her animals. Employees would sometimes visit her property, which had several dogs and horses. The animals were kept in poor conditions: dirty pens, inadequate shelter, and little interaction. One employee told me that the horses rarely left their stalls, and the dogs were aggressive because they weren't socialized properly. The most shocking story came from a delivery driver who said he saw a dog tied up outside during a snowstorm with no blanket or cover. When he mentioned it to her, she reportedly said, "It's a dog. It'll survive." I can't confirm every detail, but enough people shared similar accounts to make me believe there was truth to it. It was hard to reconcile these stories with the company's image of outdoor adventure and care for the environment. I eventually left Columbia Sportswear, but the experience taught me an important lesson. Public personas can be wildly different from private realities. It's a reminder to look deeper than appearances when judging leaders. Story 33. back when I worked at a grocery store, I found out we were extending expiration dates on perishables. It started small, just a few items here and there, but it quickly became standard practice across the board. Management wanted to reduce waste and boost profits, so instead of throwing out old inventory, they had us replace the expiration stickers with new ones. Milk, eggs, deli meats, you name it. If it wasn't visibly spoiled, it got a new date. One day, a customer returned a package of ground beef, saying it smelled awful despite being fresh. I checked the back stock and found several more packages with the same issue. When I brought it up to my manager, he just said, "Don't worry about it. If they complain, we'll refund them." Felt so wrong. People trusted us to provide safe food, and we were knowingly selling expired products. I started warning friends and family to always check for signs of spoilage, no matter what the label said. Story 34. In 2017, I worked briefly in event management and got involved with the Victoria's Secret fashion show in Shanghai. It was supposed to be a glamorous event, but behind the scenes, it was a mess of corruption and kickbacks. Local government officials demanded bribes to approve permits. Vendors inflated their prices, knowing the show's budget could absorb it. Even the casting process was shady. Models were chosen based on who had the right connections, not necessarily on merit. One incident stands out. A contractor promised to deliver a custom stage design but didn't complete it on time. Instead of holding them accountable, the event organizers paid them extra to finish the work. It was clear the contractor had delayed intentionally to extort more money. The stress was unbelievable. Every day brought a new problem, and it felt like no one had any integrity. The models and performers were professional, but the people running the show were anything but. Story 35. I used to work in benefits administration, specifically handling COBRA coverage for people who had recently lost their jobs. The system was supposed to ensure continuous healthcare coverage, but in reality, it was a nightmare for beneficiaries. One of the biggest issues was the processing delays. People would submit their paperwork and payments on time, only to find out weeks later that their coverage hadn't been activated. In some cases, they couldn't access medical care because the delay left them uninsured. I remember one woman who called in tears because she needed a life-saving surgery. She'd paid her premium, but the hospital couldn't confirm her coverage. It turned out her payment had been sitting in a backlog for over a month. By the time we sorted it out, she'd already postponed her surgery twice. The worst part was that these delays weren't accidents. They were the result of understaffing and poor management. The company knew it was happening but refused to invest in better systems or more employees. Story 36. I once worked on a film set and had to sign a strict NDA. At the time, I thought it was to protect the movie from leaks, but I later learned the real reason. NDAs are mostly about silencing people during production. One of my co-workers explained it to me. The NDAs expire by the time the movie is released, so their primary purpose isn't preventing spoilers. Instead, they're about keeping cast and crew quiet while the production is still in progress. I saw this firsthand when a lighting tech was injured on set. He wanted to talk to the press about unsafe working conditions, but the NDA prevented him from doing so. By the time the NDA expired, the story was old news, and no one cared anymore. Story 37. I worked at a high-end spa that offered premium skincare treatments. These treatments cost hundreds of dollars and were marketed as using rare, natural ingredients. What the customers didn't know was that most of the products we used were cheap, off-brand creams repackaged in fancy jars. One day, I saw a coworker filling a gold-labeled jar with lotion from a $5 drugstore bottle. When I asked about it, she shrugged and said, "We do this all the time. No one can tell the difference." It made me feel so guilty. Clients would rave about how soft their skin felt after treatments, believing they were experiencing the effects of luxury products. In reality, they were paying for ambience and branding, not quality. What bothered me most was that some treatments claimed to be hypoallergenic or safe for sensitive skin. But since the actual products weren't what was advertised, there was no guarantee they were safe at all. Story 38. I once worked for a sportswear company that sponsored a well-known athlete. Part of my job was handling their promotional gear, which included custom sneakers, jerseys, and other items. But here's the kicker. The athlete never actually wore the products. Instead, we had a team of doubles, people who matched the athlete's height, build, and skin tone. They'd pose for photos, wear the gear during shoots, and even do action shots like dunking basketballs or running sprints. The athlete would show up just long enough to record a quick promo video, then leave. The doubles were sworn to secrecy, and we had to edit every photo meticulously to make it look like the athlete was in action. It felt so fake, especially since the company presented the athlete as someone who genuinely loved and used our products. The craziest part? The athlete didn't even like the gear. They had a clause in their contract that allowed them to wear competitors' products as long as they weren't in public. Story 39. I briefly worked for a startup that claimed to be developing cutting-edge AI. They touted their proprietary algorithm as revolutionary and secured millions in funding. But behind the scenes, there was no algorithm, just a team of interns manually processing data to make it look like the AI was working. One of my tasks was to prepare reports generated by the AI. I'd input raw data, and the interns would analyze it and format it to look like it came from the system. Investors were blown away by the results, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running a scam. The CEO kept promising that the real AI was almost ready, but months went by with no progress. It became clear that the company's only goal was to secure more funding, not to actually deliver a product. I left when I realized how deep the deception ran. It felt like a house of cards that could collapse at any moment. Story 40. I worked as a bartender at a nightclub that was infamous for its wild parties. One night, we hosted a private event for a tech company celebrating a product launch. The CEO, a well-known figure in the industry, rented out the entire club and spared no expense. By midnight, the event had spiraled into chaos. There were VIP rooms filled with influencers and executives doing lines of coke off the tables. One guy even tried to bribe me with $500 to let him bring a pet snake into the club. The CEO was the wildest of them all. He jumped onto the bar, grabbed a bottle of champagne, and started pouring it over himself while shouting, "This is tech money, baby!" The crowd went nuts, and people started climbing onto tables to join him. It was the most insane shift I'd ever worked. The cleanup the next morning was brutal. Broken glass, spilled drinks, and even a pair of underwear stuffed in a planter. The event made me realize how much excess exists in certain industries. These people had more money than they knew what to do with, and they spent it like there was no tomorrow. Story 41. I used to work for a lingerie brand that prided itself on inclusivity, but the reality was far from the image they projected. In the fitting rooms, we were instructed to upsell clients into certain sizes, even if they didn't fit properly. The company's logic was simple. Larger sizes cost more, so pushing customers into them increased profits. If someone was between two sizes, we were told to recommend the bigger one, even if it wasn't the best fit. One day, a customer came in looking for a comfortable bra to wear after surgery. She trusted me because I was friendly and helpful, but when I recommended her actual size, my manager pulled me aside and scolded me. "You're here to sell, not to be nice," she said. I felt terrible. This woman was recovering from surgery, and we were prioritizing profits over her comfort. Story 42. I worked in hotel housekeeping for a summer, and the things people left behind in their rooms were wild. One room was filled with empty liquor bottles and a half-eaten wedding cake, even though no wedding had taken place at the hotel. The most shocking find was an entire suitcase filled with adult toys. The guests had already checked out, so I had to bag everything up and take it to the lost and found. My manager laughed and said, "Don't expect them to come back for that." Sure enough, no one ever claimed the suitcase. It sat in the storage room for weeks before we finally threw it out. Another time, we found a live snake in a pillowcase. The guest who left it called the front desk in a panic, and we had to carefully return it to them. Apparently, it was their emotional support animal. Working in housekeeping gave me a whole new perspective on human behavior. People can be messy, strange, and unpredictable, but they're never boring. It was one of the most memorable jobs I've ever had, and it left me with plenty of stories to tell. Story 43. I used to work as a server at a steakhouse, and we had a secret rule for dealing with rude customers. Give them the house butter. This wasn't the regular herb butter we served to everyone else. It was plain margarine that we kept in the back for emergencies. If a customer was particularly obnoxious, snapping fingers, yelling at staff, or being disrespectful, we'd swap out their butter. They'd never know the difference, but it gave us a little sense of justice. One night, a man came in and berated his server over every little thing. He loudly complained about the temperature of his steak, the lighting, and even the music playing in the background. The server came into the kitchen, fuming, and said, "He's getting the house butter." We all watched from the sidelines as he slathered his steak with margarine, completely unaware. It was a small, harmless way to reclaim some dignity in a job where we were often treated poorly. Story 44. I worked as a personal assistant for a Hollywood producer, and one of my tasks was managing his special calendar. This calendar wasn't for meetings or work, it was for scheduling his hookups. He'd assign code names to different women and leave cryptic notes about what gifts to buy them. One time, he asked me to pick up a specific perfume and deliver it to a hotel room where he'd be meeting someone later that night. It was surreal. I didn't know how to handle it at first, but everyone else in the office acted like it was completely normal. They'd say things like, "Oh, that's just how he is." The worst part was seeing how he treated these women. He'd shower them with gifts for a few weeks, then drop them without a second thought. I felt complicit, but I needed the job.